Eventually, you're going to need a flattening jig.
Whether it's due to a questionable glue up or a twisted slab that your thickness planer can't handle, you'll find many flattening jigs on the market. However, store-bought comes with a hefty price, especially for a jig that's pretty simple to make.
If you're like me, spending $1,200 on a jig ain't happening.
Here are two DIY options to consider. The easiest option, which we're going to call the Economical Jig, and the almost store-bought option, which we're going to call the not $1,200 jig.
The cost of this jig is going to depend on your scrap pile and or the size of the jig you need for your project. So in a way, this jig can cost nothing, but in a much more real sense, nothing more than you've already spent.
I prefer to make my rails from a sheet good like OSB. That is a joke. Plywood or MDF, preferably 3/4 of an inch thick. If you don't want to buy a whole sheet, you could buy a project panel, baseboard molding, or a shelf board. Me, I'm going to be using 1/2 inch MDF that I will laminate together, as I want to save my 3/4 inch sheet for a different project. But regardless of the material and the size of the flattening jig you need, the process for everything is pretty much the same. Quick PSA, this was a bit of a fool's errand. Unless all you have to work with is thin scraps, this whole lamination process in a 90-degree shop wasn't worth the extra time and effort that it took me to do. All because I was trying to save like $20. I'm frugal, but I have now learned my limit. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This was not worth all the extra work. I should have just used the 3/4 inch material that I already have and saved myself a few hours. Also, did I mention that it's 90 degrees in my shop right now? It's hot. We'll chalk this up to knowledge gained and move on. The height of your rails is going to depend on the thickness of wood that you're planning on flattening. Whatever that is, the rail should be slightly higher then, but not so high that the router bit can't reach the wood. Semi-pro tip, make sure you account for the thickness of the material when cutting down your rails. I'm going to go with 4-inch rails, but also 2.5 inch rails. Let me show you what I mean. Rather than attach the rails to a board to act as a base, I prefer to clamp the rails down to my workbench. I'm butt joining these boards together with pocket holes. Make sure to take your time here. I clamped around each pocket hole to make sure the board wouldn't move on me once I added the screw. Don't rush this step, as it's part of the double dragon magic of these rails.
Destiny has brought together the double dragons.
I now have a rail that's a little over 4 inches. And yet also 2.5 inches. This design also allows for easier storage of the rails when the flattening jig isn't being used. The dimension of the sled is going to depend on your router. Measure your router base, then add 1/8 of an inch. And add the thickness of the sled side rails. In this case, we're using 3¼ inch melamine, so we'll go ahead and add 1.5 inches to the overall width of the sled base. The length of the sled is going to depend on your needs. My suggestion would be to make it as wide as the surface that you're going to be flattening on, then add about 8 inches. You'll see why, more on that later. I made my sled walls 3 inches tall, for no particular reason, but I can't see a reason why you'd want to go lower than 2. The best way to attach the sled walls is with pocket holes. You could also screw up from the bottom, but pocket holes are my preferred way to attach the sled walls. This will help to make sure that the base of the sled is flat, and the rails will only have to reference one surface. Attaching the sled walls from the side can create some errors if everything doesn't line up perfectly. And this method also creates 3 points of reference for the rails, which increases your chance of error. Also, screwing from the side can expand the material, regardless if you pre-drill. I like to create the slot for the surfacing bit after the sled is built, as I try to avoid having to measure as much as possible. Less of a chance of me messing something up that way. I use a 2-inch hole saw bit to start, and then my track saw to remove the rest of the material. This could be done with a jigsaw, however, me and the jigsaw aren't friends. And now you could be technically done,
but for your safety and the safety of your project, adding some blocking to the rails in the sled is a good idea. Blocking will make sure that you can't run off the rails and nick your project, or cut into the rails. neither of which I've done before.
To keep the sled from falling off the side of the rails, adding something as simple as a C-clamp will do the trick. You could also just drill a hole and make a little blocking with a screw, or use a bolt, some scrap wood, and a nut. Or you could just use a wing nut and a bolt, but those last two require the next safety update. To make sure that the sled doesn't fall forward off the rails, you will want to add a lip to the sled. I'm also going to lock down one side of the sled as a reference point. Make sure not to make this too tight of a fit, or the sled will get stuck on the rails. If you don't have a set of playing cards in your shop, you should get some. They come in very handy. There's still one more safety feature that you should add. Since the rails are movable, you're also going to want to have a movable blocking for the sled. This was done with some offcuts, a few washers, a bolt, a nut, a few different drill bits, and some super glue. Now, it probably would be better to use a 5-minute epoxy or JP weld to ensure the bolt and the nut are glued in more permanently. But I didn't have either in my shop at the time, so super glue is working out just fine. Semi-pro tip: if your rails are too tall for the slab or the board you're trying to flatten, rather than do something dangerous like barely put the router bit into the router collet, find a material that you know is flat, like MDF plywood or my example here, melamine, to raise the wood up, and then you should be good to go. The maximum cut-in area for this jig is 28 inches by 42 inches, and the rails came out to be 49 inches long, and the sled is 39 inches long by about 8 inches wide.
This jig is great, and for some of you, this is all you're going to need. But going the cheapest route, you do compromise on a couple things, like durability. Over time, friction will wear down the MDF and plywood. Dust collection. There is none. If you can do this outside, that's the best option. I don't have that option, which is one of the main reasons I'm building the not $1,200 jig. Personally, I want something a little bit more sturdy, as I use the flattening jig at least twice a month, and a little bit of luxury would be nice.
The rails for this jig are going to be made out of linear guide rails. I designed my workbench with dog holes specifically for these rails, and also created these extension wings to utilize the rails as well. To secure the riser in the dog holes, I'm going to be using these spring hose clamps. If you'd like to see how this workbench was built, link in the description. But you don't need this type of workbench in order to build this jig. You will need to create some type of riser blocks to connect the bottom rail to the workbench, and to increase the cut-in height of the jig. You can just screw the rails to the riser block and the riser block to the workbench.
But don't attach anything yet, as we'll need to complete these next steps first.
For the top rails, I bought them just long enough to fit my workbench. That way, I can utilize the complete width of my bench. For $17, you could step up to the next length, which would give you about 12 more inches of cut surface, and still be way under that $1,200 cost of the woodpecker mill. The bottom and top rail assembly is pretty straightforward. You just need to attach the top rail to the bottom rail bearings. The railings that I bought came with screws, which is very nice.
So as it turns out, the screws that came with this bottom rail are too long to actually connect the top rail. I always make sure to keep any random screw, bolt, fastener, however you want to call it, for times like this.
No, nope, no again. But after an instant replay, I was able to find a few screws in the second bin. Not enough, but enough to keep me going for now, until my Amazon order comes in the mail.
So always check twice before you give up, and never surrender. The main decision that you're going to have to make with this type of jig is, how do you want the router base to fit in the rails?
In a way, I'm going to be building my router base a lot like the router sled. Same as before, measure the base and include the thickness of your material in the width. But since this router base is going to be fixed, you don't have to worry about adding any additional gaps. To attach the router base to the top rail bearings, I went with the method I felt reduces my chance of creating error. A simple butt joint using what I call the sandwich method. The key is to get 2 strips of wood cut to the exact same width, as the router base and the wood that's going to be attached to the top rail bearings will reference off of this. I'm making my router base from scrap wood, so it's basically free. For this next part, we need to make some holes for the router and the dust port. Owning a hole saw drill bit larger than 2 inches would be helpful, but since I don't have one and would rather not pick up a jigsaw, I used the laser cutter to create the templates for the holes in the router base, and use the dust port and the router plate to mark the attachment locations. But before I can start routing out the hole, I need to remove some material and learn a lesson. Bigger ain't always better, and I'm completely doing this as an example for you.
I knew that wasn't going to work. I just didn't want to use my jigsaw.
Is anyone buying that? No? Okay, moving on. It was easier to just use the 10 ring method, which is using a smaller Forstner type bit to bore out multiple holes to create one big hole. Then I could go ahead and use my router with a flush trim bit to remove the rest of the material. Then I went ahead and drilled out the mounting holes for the router plate and countersunk them. And went ahead and tested everything to make sure it fit, which it clearly does. For the dust port, I went ahead and just attached that with some screws. Now we are ready to attach the router base to the top rail bearings. To do this, I need to create a very complicated template using some fancy paper. And by fancy, I mean some cardstock. From there, I could create a plywood template with oversized holes, which I then used to create a master template that I could use to make the left and right rail bearing attachment pieces. Semi-pro tip. To prevent blowout, clamp a sacrificial board under the wood and then make sure you start your drill before you actually contact the material.
Did I do this perfectly on the first try? Of course I did. I'm a professional. Why do you ask?
Then I could go ahead and glue, pre-drill, and add a bunch of screws to attach the rail bearing attachment piece to the router base. And you could stop here with the router base and attach it to the bearings now. But I added a dust port, and it would be pretty inefficient without a dust brush. I went ahead and added some additional plywood to the front and the back of the router base to be able to attach the dust brush with a bunch of screws. I would be lying if I said I measured anything before I bought this dust brush. This is a rare time where I just got lucky and everything worked out. The screws that I have bought from Amazon have arrived. I can go ahead and take out these old screws and reattach the railings with these brand new shiny screws. Then I could finally attach the router base to the top rail bearings with the screws that came with the top rails. The washers, on the other hand, did not come with the rails. Those I already had. To stop the top rails from binding at times, I'm going to go ahead and add some scrap wood to the front and back of the rails. I did have to drill some new holes into the metal to do this, which was surprisingly easier than I thought it would be. At this point, I can go ahead now and finally secure the bottom rail to the risers. If you're not using dog holes, then this is more like the risers to the workbench. And once that's done, you're going to want to move the top rail to the far left or right, wherever you want to start, to use the top rails as a spacer to then attach the back bottom rail to the riser or to the workbench, depending on your setup. To make this comparable to the store-bought jig, we need to add some safety features. So that means some stop blocks, which you could make, but I chose to just buy these shaft collars to make things a little simpler. One more thing that you can do for safety is hang your dust collection hose and your power cord so they don't get in your way. I previously made this Lincoln Street inspired boom arm that will help with that. It includes a plug-in and a connection port for my dust collection. This helps to get everything out of my way. Well, for the most part. Now we can go ahead and test and see if this dust collection actually works. So this is way better than without dust collection, but my lack of a real dust collector is obvious. But it did keep all the dust out of the air, so I'll go ahead and take that as a small victory. I would recommend cutting the dust brush down, as mine is too long and was causing the rails to bind at times. The maximum cut-in area for this jig is 35.5 inches by 67.5 inches. The bottom rails are 79 inches long, and the top rails are 47 inches long. Here's a full breakdown of the cost, in case you were wondering.
There you have it. 2 options that will save you a lot of money, so you can buy more tools. I'm Joseph with 5 Duck Studio. Hope to see you next time. Want to be the stand without you.